A long time ago, way back in history, when all there was to drink was nothing but cups of tea, along came a man by the name of Charlie Mops. He invented a wonderful drink, and he made it out of hops. Oh, he must have been an admiral, a sultan or a king, and to his praises we shall always sing. Look what he has done for us, he's filled us up with cheer. Lord bless Charlie Mops, the man who invented beer, 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 tiddly beer, 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 beer.
Is to assemble all the raw materials for the mash. The bulk of the grist, as it's called, is malt. This is pale malt. I buy it pre-crushed, although you can buy the whole grains, and then you have to have a mill to crush it to a consistency rather like that. So, first of all, I put about half of this sack into this dustbin, like so. And then I add the other types of grain which I put into the bitter. I do a bitter beer. Crystal malt is the one which is very favourite, and I put 3 pounds of crystal malt in, which gives it a rather nice flavour. It's difficult to describe what, but it does. Wheat malt, I put 1 pound of wheat malt in, and that's for head retention, so that when you're drinking your pint, the head stays on the glass and looks nice. So that's 1 pound of wheat malt, 3 pounds of crystal malt. Now I buy that whole, not crushed. It's a bit like coffee. If you buy coffee pre-made or you buy coffee grains, it's a bit better. And I've got a mill here which has been made from an old coffee grinder attached to a 1/2-inch drill. And the hopper here, as you see, is made out of a funnel and a bucket. And it works very well. So at this stage I put the crystal malt in the hopper and the wheat malt, and then we turn it on. After I've turned it on, you won't hear me say anything because it's rather noisy. That's all the adjuncts in, so we just add the rest of the pale malt, and that should bring the quantity of the grist, or the goods I think they call it, the quantity of the goods up to the top of the bin, which is enough to make 36 gallons odd of a premium bitter. So now we'll go over and prepare the mash tun I've got. Is based on a couple of school kitchen boilers. The one you're looking at is the mash tun, and all I did was to take the gas ring from underneath it and insulate it with polyurethane foam so that it's rather like a large thermos flask. In the bottom there's a perforated disc, again made of stainless steel. And if you want to know how I made that, it was made by sticking a piece of graph paper over it and drilling little holes at all the joints of the lines. And yes, it took an awfully long time. I'm starting to fill up the mash tun with hot water, which is being heated by this gas water heater. The brewery is run by propane because when we first moved to this place there was no electricity, and in fact we were on a generator for a matter of 12 years, and so the use of electricity for heating purposes was completely out. So not only do I heat the water with that water heater that you can see on the wall, but underneath the boiler, which I'll show you in a minute, there is another gas ring worked by the same propane bottle. Right, that's 16.5 gallons in there, so I can now turn the heater off and get on with the business of mashing. Now mashing is quite simply mixing the grain with hot water and allowing the enzymes which are in the grain to convert all the starch that's in there into sugar, which can then be fermented by the yeast in the next process. The very critical bit here though is that the temperature that the mash finishes at has got to be exactly right. If it's too hot or too cold, there's problems. The correct temperature is between 148 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if I put all that grain into this water, and if the water's at about 162 in the summer and 164 in the winter, because of course that'll be colder in the winter, it settles out at about the right temperature. This is just a question of trial and error really, and when you first do this business you have to hurriedly add a little bit of boiling water or a little bit of cold water to get it to settle out at the correct temperature. Now another little technical bit comes in now. Many years ago it was discovered that the best beers were made at Burton-on-Trent, or the best bitters, and stouts and so forth were made in Dublin and London. And this wasn't really because there were good brewers in those towns, it was because the quality of the water was just right for the type of beer that was being made. Now luckily today we can convert water from any part of the country into a very good approximation of the water found naturally in the deep wells at Burton-on-Trent. And here, for example, in Plymouth, the water is extremely soft because it comes down over the moors. So we have to add salts to make it hard. And the two particular salts that I use are gypsum and magnesium sulfate, which to you is plaster of Paris and Epsom salts. And it takes only something like 3 teaspoonfuls of that and 1.5 of that in there to convert this to what is known in the trade as Burtonized liquor. Water in the brewing business is stuff you wash your hands with, wash all the vessels with. If it's going to be used for beer, it suddenly stops being water and it's called liquor. And if it's hard, like the Burton-on-Trent stuff, it's called Burtonized liquor. Isn't that interesting? Right, there go the hardening salts in. Now it's all happening. Now we just very carefully check the temperature finally. 160, 161, 162. Right. Let mashing begin. Now this is one aspect of it that I'd like to improve. One day I'll make a nice little box over the top of here to run this stuff in with, but this is the way it's done at the moment. You'll note the approved mashing paddle. Years ago they used to get all the serfs of the village with one of these to do this. Huge great mash tuns and about 20 people stirring it all in. Just pour it in quietly and make sure you don't get any lumps really. This takes considerable time, as you can see. It probably take me the best part of 4 or 5 minutes to get it completely stirred in. Beautiful smell coming up now. Really lovely. Towards the end, I find it's easier to do it with 2 hands, like this. That's the last little bit in. That noise you can hear, by the way, that's our water pump started up, because we're on a well here. We're not on mains water. We had to dig a hole and find it. So all this is coming straight out of the ground without benefit of chlorine or aluminium sulphate, courtesy South West Water. There you are. That's the mash finished. Last little stir. The last stick the thermometer in. Shut the lid and let the little enzyme. The mash has now been standing for a couple of hours. And before I start to transfer it, I'll just show you what other vessels we've got in the brewery. This is the boiler. Again, the converted school kitchen boiler, and has a large gas ring underneath. This is the fermenting vessel, and the brief process now is we take the liquid from the mash tun, put it into the boiler, boil it up with the hops, put it in the fermenting vessel, and ferment it with the yeast. In a perfect world, this boiler would be large enough so that when it was full, I could then transfer the liquid into the fermenting vessel, which would then also be full. Unfortunately, it's not quite big enough. So we do a little bit of a cheat. I've boiled up, whilst we've been waiting, 8 gallons of water. That's boiled to make sure that it's completely sterile, no little bugs in it. And that is now going to be put into the fermenting vessel. So we're really making a fairly strong beer and then slightly diluting it as we're putting it into the fermenter. This stuff is known as liquor ahead, nice term. And so I shall now be putting some salts in here as well to make it Burtonized liquor ahead, and then transferring it into the fermenter. The fermenting vessel has got to be absolutely scrupulously clean, and that's been done with a special sterilising liquid, and I'm now just rinsing it out and letting the water run down through the fermenter, onto the floor and out to the river. Despite its appearance, this fermenting vessel is not made from a couple of old oil drums. It is stainless steel, and it's what's known as a cylindriconical vessel, which is another nice word. So it's a cylinder, and right at the bottom of it there's a cone. And what you're watching there is just the water being that copper ring, just to wash it and make sure it's absolutely rinsed properly. Some cylindriconical fermenting vessels. These are the ones at the Courage Brewery up near Reading. There's about 16 of them, and that's the outside view, and underneath they look like that. And the idea of this is that all the yeast, when it drops out, drops to the bottom of the cone and can be removed, and that's why I've made my little one the same way. You can see the stainless steel bit at the top. The 2 oil drums are merely a water jacket so that I can heat or cool the beer when it's being fermented, because in the winter it can get too cold, and like Vicky Burker in the summer it gets much too hot. So I've got a heater, which you can just see, that little black box has got a element in it, a kettle element, and over here we've got an old milk cooler which came from a a farm, and that one just makes cold water, so we're able to control the temperature of the brew at all stages. Now the mash is about ready. You can see it's just dropped a couple of degrees from the 150. So now is the time to start transferring. What we're going to do is to drop it into this under back, and then via a small pump and around the pipes into the copper. Now this particular moment is called setting taps. So he starts. One or two explanations. You might have noticed I just said I was going to run it into an underback. The brewery trade doesn't have things called Dixie cans or billies or containers, they're backs. If you have a tank of hot water, it's a hot liquor back. If you have a tank of cold water, it's a cold liquor back. Likewise, this isn't a stainless steel boiler, it's a copper. Even today, all the boilers are made of stainless steel, but they're still known as coppers, which is rather nice. So here we go now. This has changed from being liquor. It's now called wort, pronounced wort, and spelt W-O-R-T. You'll see that I've got a sort of a sieve arrangement here, just to take any bits of barley that get carried over. This is just a simple nylon bag. And this gadget is a colander to stop the nylon bag getting sucked down the pipe. I've got a small pump, which is just out of the picture, which is on a variable speed switch. And I can just adjust the speed so that it starts to pump the wort up into the copper. Righty-ho. Piece of machinery, slowly rotating on top of the mash tun, is sprinkling hot water on top of the grains and washing all the sugar that's left in the grains through. This process isn't called spraying, it's called sparging. So what we are doing really is sparging our wort at the moment. Over there you'll see a sample jar. I've just taken a sample of the first runnings of the wort coming from the mash tun for checking to see how much sugar is in them. Now this process is totally automatic and it takes about 1 hour 20 minutes to fill the copper right up. I say it's totally automatic, but you have to keep your eye on it in case the pump stops or the sparger stops going around and various other little things that can go wrong. And here we see the wort coming into the copper. It's about 2 inches from the top when it's full. And in case you're wondering, that sparger thing is made simply from little bits of copper pipe and an old clock motor. Auto Sparger Mark 1. After there's a little bit of wort in the copper, we can light the boiler. That's the pilot jet. He just swings underneath. And there we go. You'll note there's a neatly placed little mirror there so that you can see how the flame's getting on without bending down all the time. As I say, about 1 hour 20 minutes, and the copper is nearly up, so we'll shortly shut off the sparge, turn off the pump, and then as she comes up to the boil we'll have to start thinking in terms of the addition of the hop. Now this is a bit of a critical time because it's just coming up to the boil, and of course you've got to be very careful that it doesn't boil over, which can make an awful mess. So what, I have a tool here for turning the gas down. A little bit, and I've got the lid right open. If I had the lid shut it would really sort of froth up and be all over the floor. Once it's all come to the boil, it settles down and there's no problem there. You have to boil it again for about 1.5 hours. So the whole process of this brewing takes most of the day. It's sort of I hope he's not going to turn him right down. Marvellous if we get an overflow on the film. Again, in a perfect world we'd have a nice closed boiler with a top and a chimney going up, but I don't. So while that's kind of just settling itself down, I can mention about the hops. I hope. Now in this 36 gallon batch we're doing, we use 1 pound of hops, which is put in for 2 reasons. Firstly, think about it a bit, methinks. Firstly, to act as a preservative, because the resins in the hop, they counteract all the spoilage bacteria which can turn the stuff off. Well, that's second really, and the other reason is the bitterness which blends with the sweet taste of the malt. They started putting hops in beer in about 1600 and something, I think, and it's interesting to note that the correct definition of ale is a beverage without hops, and it's only when the hops are put in that it becomes beer. So all this business of real ale is a lot of hooey. It's not real ale at all, it's real beer. But of course the terms have come to mean the same now. Ale and beer means the same, but that was the original difference between them. I won't just lob this entire pound in there, because when it boils it tends to take all the nice oily, bittery taste, gets boiled away. So you boil about 70% and 20% are kept as what they call keep outs, and you put those in right at the end of the 1.5 hour boil. So about that much will go in now, and the last little bit, well, what I actually do is I put a little bit in 10 minutes before the end of the boil and a little bit in as I turn the thing off. So there go the last of the hops for the main boil. And now it's all quite happy. So we'll shut him down and leave him to boil away on his own. There is the most beautiful smell coming off from that. It's a pity you can't smell it. It is absolutely delicious. Right, now the boil is finished and we're recirculating the wort, directing it into the back into the copper tangentially, as you can see. This gives it a whirlpool effect, and all the hops and all the shrub gets together in a little cone in the middle. It all sort of comes together. And as it goes round and round, it's being filtered through the hotbed. So this is a sort of filtration and the whirlpool effect all in one. We do this for about 10 minutes. Now I've turned the pump off and just letting that settle. And whilst that's happening, I've got the yeast out of the fridge. And I've just stuck it in the mash tun, which is still quite warm, and put a couple of measures of the wort, which I've cooled first, of course, so the yeast is now starting to wake up and think, oh, goody goody, something to eat at last. This particular strain of yeast is proper brewer's yeast. It comes all the way from Burton-on-Trent, belongs to Iron Coop, and I get it from a local brewery. They don't mind giving it to you because they wind up with more than they start with every time you do a brew, so it's a bit like a ginger beer plant. It grows and grows and grows. And now we are casting the copper and pumping the wort right up and into the top of the fermenter. Now you can see the wort being sprayed into the fermenter. Doesn't do it any harm getting a bit of air in it at this stage. Likes a bit of oxygen. At the same time we've got cooling water going round to cool it down as she goes in. And there's the copper slowly emptying. And that's all the cooling water going to waste. Whilst you're outside, you might just well have a look around. In a professional brewery, of course, the cooling water is used to heat up the liquor for the next day's brew. They use a thing called a paraflow. That'll be a good meal for next week. Dove pie cooked in beer. And that's called shrub. That's the hops and all the bits and pieces. Acted as a filter. That'll be chucked on the garden. And the brewer's grains will be eaten by grateful pigs.
She's getting a cane, you know, that little ewe. All in its ears.
Last thing to do now is just stir it up and take a sample with a jug. that's a sample I've just taken, and the purpose of taking it before the yeast goes in is to see how much sugar is in solution. This is a hydrometer which tells you exactly the amount of sugar that's in there. That's got an original gravity of 1042. See how high it's floating? If you stick it in water, it floats right down there. 1042, that's about the same as a good pub bitter, a premium bitter. It's about what I'm trying to make at this time of year. Yeast obviously likes it. That little sample that I gave it, it's grown so it's nearly climbing out of that little bucket. So all that remains now is just to check that the temperature of the wort is below 74 and tip this lot in, and then we can all go to bed. Well, that's it then. I've just put the yeast in. 5:45. Cheers. Now 24 hours has gone past, and I'm now indulged in one of the more moribund aspects of brewing, which is called digging out the mash tun. But much more interestingly is come and see what the yeast has been doing to the wort in our fermenting vessel. Now, I've always regarded brewer's yeast as the Houdini. It will escape from anything. You probably saw it try to climb out of my bucket that I brought it back from the brewery in. Is it going to stay in this fermenting vessel? Is it hell as like? So I have had to invent this yeast retaining collar. A very technical piece of equipment, as you can see. You have absolutely no idea the complications this is taking to make this picture. And though I hate to repeat myself, there's a glorious smell coming out from there. Nice and sweet, little estery sort of smell. Well, nearly a week's gone by, so let's go and see how the fermenting's getting on. During the fermentation process, the yeast, as it converts the sugar into alcohol and produces CO2, you get this tremendous head that builds up. It's been known to come over the top of my yeast collar, which I showed you on the top of the fermenter earlier. The temperature of this initial fermentation has to be kept between about 65 degrees to 74 Fahrenheit. 74 is about the top. In large breweries they have to control this because the process itself creates heat, and so they have cooling coils called attenuators through which they pass cooling water to keep the temperature below that 74 degree. Here we don't have that problem particularly, but we do have the trouble that on cold winter nights the temperature can get too cold. So I've got this heater which I built into the system, and that one comes on and keeps the temperature up. Now during the fermentation, twice a day, morning and evening, I take a couple of samples from the tap at the bottom. I've got a couple of jugs. I usually take the first little bit to be thrown away because it's mostly dead yeast and so forth. And then this is the one which I'll use to check the temperature and the gravity. The first thing we do is take the thermometer and stick it in the sample. Meanwhile, wash out the graduation cylinder. All these utensils are kept in the bucket of sterilising fluid at the moment so that there's no contamination, because of course the sample, being mean, goes back into the fermenter. Now that's 70 degrees, which is top end. Now we put them in there, take out our faithful hygrometer, give it a swill, have a look. All this is going on. We've got all these casks to wash out. I usually leave them standing in sterilising, with sterilising liquid in, for about 12 hours or something. And then I've got a very useful little brush which goes in there, and you can wash all the gubbins out, run it down into the next one. 2, 3. This is not a barrel of beer. This is a cask. A barrel is a measurement of quantity. A barrel holds 36 gallons of beer or whatever. Unfortunately, these days people talk about barrels of beer and they think of things like this. If you divided a barrel in half, you'd have a thing called a kilderkin, a kill. If you divided that in half, you'd have a firkin. This is a firkin. Many humorous jokes have been made about the firkin. And if you reduce that in half, you have a pin, which is 4.5 gallons, which would be that filled up to there and cut in about now. Now here we are about 8 days after the original day of brewing, and it's time for the big racking session where I take all the beer out of the fermenter and put it into the casks. However, a word or two at this stage wouldn't go amiss regarding the legality of this business. You are allowed to make beer at home. You are not allowed to sell it. I make beer at home. As long as it's not sold, there's no problem. I used to make beer illegally because in something like 1963 you had to have a license, and I was in fact or my father and I were making beer prior to the day when Reginald Maudling, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in those days, eased the situation so you didn't need a brewing license to make beer at home. What we used to have to do actually was to go around to Boots the chemist, which was the only place you could get hops and malt extract, and we'd go in there one day and get the malt extract, and then go there about 2 or 3 days later and get the hops. And in those days you got the hops from little chemist drawers next door to the cellar pods. They were sort of things which were used for problems among elderly ladies. So now here we are, starting to fill our little casks. Now this is the reason why the fermenting vessel is up in the air, because it makes it a lot easier to do this sort of job. Now that's rather a sad moment, because that's the last pint of the last guile, or batch to you, brewed June the 30th. And it's now August the 28th. And that's the new one. Oh, not bad at all. Now, if you believe a word that I've been saying up to now, which I doubt if you do, you certainly won't believe this bit. This is regarding finings. Now, finings are made from the swim bladder of the sturgeon fish. And a small quantity of finings put into the final cask of beer help all the sediment drop down to the bottom. I've always wondered which Russian was sitting on the shore of the Black Sea watching these sturgeons swimming around and thinking to himself, I'll catch one of those, take out its swim bladder, dry it, dissolve it in acid and put it in the beer and it'll make it better. But somebody did, and it does, as I'll show you now. There he goes. Very well metered quantity. And you just dissolve it in there, like so. Opens it up. Tip him in. Shuts it up. Making sure that doesn't fall over. Give it a bit of a shake like this. There you go. One cask of fine bitter. Right, now having made the beer, the next most important thing is how to store it and keep it, and how to serve it properly. Most people these days use these polypins. They hold about 5 gallons, 5.5, made of plastic, clear plastic, so you can see how much beer you've got in. That one's full, that one's empty. The tops, and this is important, have got a pressure relief valve in them, so that if the pressure inside here builds up to more than about 10 pounds per square inch, it is released through a small rubber band which expands. I used to have trouble with these caps leaking. The rubber bands perished and you'd come back to a cask about a fortnight after you'd filled it and find it was completely flat. There's an easy way to determine if this is happening or not, because all you have to do is have a gadget like this. This is a small pressure gauge and a piece of plastic pipe. Now luckily these taps are made so that you can twiddle them around upside down, like so. So to test if there's any pressure in the barrel, you put the plastic pipe on, then carefully open the tap, and you can see, in fact, we've got 11 pounds per square inch in this one at the moment. Now do remember to turn the tap off, and this is important, before removing the gauge. This cask is fitted with not only a pressure relief valve, it's fitted with an injector. The purpose of this is, as you draw the beer off, to start with, it's making its own carbon dioxide, and that replaces the volume that the beer's left. When you're getting to about halfway through the barrel, you'll find that there isn't sufficient gas being produced by the beer, and you have to either slacken the top to let air in. If you don't do that, air will come back up the tap and go bubble, bubble, bubble. Or you use an injector to replace the volume with carbon dioxide. And this is done with a gadget such as this. You screw it on. You have to be rather careful doing this. You just give it half a second burst. It just goes psh, and that's enough. If you put too much in, the pressure relief valve will release the rest. But there's absolutely no point in putting more CO2 in than you need just to replace the beer that's been drawn off. Now when you first start to draw beer off from your cask, you will probably be a bit disappointed because you open the tap very, very slowly if it's under pressure and just let a little bit of it trickle out. Now, the first glass or so that you get will look like mud, and the reason is a glass of mud. The finings have settled all the yeast and bits and pieces, and some will have settled by the tap. So the first little bit, you get all that into the glass, you throw that away, continue maybe a couple of glasses, and then it should be bright and clear. Now the way that beer is served in a pub is a very contentious issue. There are three basic ways that you can serve beer. You take the cask and you stick it up behind the bar with a tap, you open the tap, draw the beer off. That's a very simple way. Problems here of course is that the bar can be rather warm in the summer. So they tend to put the casks in a cellar which they can keep at a reasonable temperature. And then to get it from the cellar up to the bar, you have a thing called a beer engine. Now a beer engine, I'll show you one in a moment, is a mechanical pump, and it merely pulls the beer from the cask up to the bar. Down in the cellar, the beer that's drawn off will be replaced by air, and a cask of beer being served like this will last about 3 days. At the end of 3 days, the air that's gone into the cask will start to turn it sour. So a good publican will move the beer, buy it in the correct size cask, so that at the end of 3 days it's all gone. Unfortunately, of course, this isn't a perfect world, and you can see the point where beer's, what is it, £1.50, £1.60 or something a pint now. It takes a strong man to pour it away if it's not quite up to the mark. So the breweries in the 60s and 70s invented a way which was a bit more foolproof, and as the beer was drawn off the cask, they replaced it with carbon dioxide from a large cylinder and a pressure relief valve. And then they thought, well, why not use the pressure in the gas cylinder to actually push the beer up to the bar? So this is what most kegs and non-real ale pubs, if you like, is the way that they serve their beer. You've got a little font thing on the bar, a little tap, and the barmaid tweaks it, and the gas forces the beer up to the little spout and into the glass. What's wrong with that, you say? Well, the problem is that carbon dioxide can go into solution, and because it's probably working on 8 or 9 pounds per square inch on top of the beer, it gets into the beer and makes a very fizzy, gassy drink, and you spend all evening belching.
If you want to get really sophisticated, this is a beer engine made by a firm called Hallmark. Initially they think they made it to serve wine. It pulls 1/4 of a pint per pull of the handle. This is our larder, and you'll see that I've got the cask of beer down on the floor. It doesn't take up very much room. The inverted tap trick again, and you'll note in the background, horrors to all camera members, a large CO2 cylinder. Now this is replenishing the volume above the beer, but only at atmospheric pressure. The point is that I cannot, try as I may, empty one of these casks in 3 days. So it has to last me about 3 weeks. That little gadget owes his existence to Mr. Cousteau, who invented the aqualung, and it's what it's called
a cask breather. What cask breather does is, as the beer's drawn off the cask, it just, instead of letting air get back there, it puts carbon dioxide there. It's at exactly atmospheric pressure, not a drop above it, and there's no extra gas goes into the beer. And although camera thinks it's a horrible thing, I'm afraid they, in this instance, are wrong, because I've been using it for years, and I don't think you'll get a better glass of beer than I produce. And at least I can drink it for 3 or 4 weeks after the cask has been tapped. We keep the beer in the larder in the winter, but in the summer we have problems with temperature. So I move it in about April into the feed store. A very old deep freeze. Two holes in the end. This is the bulb of a thermostat, which overrides the freezer thermostat, so it just keeps it at normal winter temperature. Now the right temperature to drink English bitter at is 56 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a little thermometer which I've recently acquired, and in fact I've got this turned down a little bit because it's a bit cold. Now 2 continents believe in drinking cold beer, and I can only think this is because the beer tastes so awful that when it's cold it completely numbs the taste buds on the tongue, so you can't actually detect any taste whatever. But good English beer, British beer even, should be drunk at 56 degrees. Remember that. Isn't that a lovely sight? Well, very good health. The problem here, of course, is that because this beer tastes so good, everybody is wanting to come in and have some. What a lot of noise. A better way, with 20 years more experience, is to drill a hole in the end of the dustbin and seal it with 2 pieces of duct tape. Like so. Then put half of all the goods in there, hump it up on top of the mash tun, put the other half in, and I'll show you what we do next. Right, here we go. Haltrack hoist. Pull it up like this, and then I've got a jam cleat off a yacht, which is most useful. Put that in there like so. And this is a clever bit. We go, hey, and then lower it down. When the water is exactly the right temperature, which I'm just about to double check, pull that off, put your finger up the hole, start it running,
and the mash is a piece of cake. Thank you. There you go. That's how it works. When it gets to the bottom, you have to just shake it every so often. Another lovely mash. We do things a little bit more accurately now. I used to take the gravity with this hydrometer, which I now call a joke hydrometer, because what a proper one looks like, it's like that. And the entire scale from there to there is equal to a little tiny pip of that one. It's important to know at this stage how much sugar is left, because it's the time that I change the fermenting temperature from quite warm, about 18 degrees, down to about 8 degrees. And at the moment it is just showing that it is down, if you can see that, to 11. I've got a range of them there. The one that goes from 40 to 50, it tells you when you first start the fermentation, so you know how strong it's going to be. Then the others are when the fermentation's almost finished. Being looked after by a small monkey boy that came from Woolworths that I had when I was about 4 years old. Hello, how are you? There's another modification I got here. Instead of that rather Mickey Mouse thermostat that I saw in the old film, this is a very clever gadget. It's a cross between a thermometer and a thermostat, so I call it a thermomostat. I ought to probably patent that. It's telling you exactly what the temperature is, and you can set it to do things at whatever temperature you ask it. So in fact what it's going to do is in 2 degrees time it's going to turn the water off that's running through cooling the fermenter at the moment. That's the heating department. That's that little pump is pumping water through the heater when I want to keep the temperature of the fermenting vessel up, and that's the 2 kilowatt heater, which surprisingly will hold this up to about 18 degrees even when it's freezing outside. This is the tap room where the beer is sampled of an evening. The generator there produced all our electricity for 9.5 years, and that gadget there is a cooler originally designed to go underneath a bar to chill lager so you couldn't taste how horrible it was, and now I use that one to cool the fermenter when I need to cool it down. It's basically just a deep freeze unit with the coils in that white water tank, and there's a stainless steel coil that the beer used to go through, which I now pump the water through, those 2 pipes at the back. And this little thing here is a stirrer motor. It's got a model ship's propeller underneath it, which just stirs the water around. Works very well actually. That came from a similar room that my father had at his house, the wine cellar. And those are some of the beer labels that have been dreamed up over the years. It's just a week after brewing, and this is the racking day, and the thing you do to start with is to test all the tops of the casks to make sure they're not going to leak. So I've got this little rig here, screw the top on. There's a rubber blow-off washer there which sometimes gives trouble, and I've just got this connected up to a simple device. I put that in there, and water pressure from the mains blows up there, blows air into there, and you'll see the pressure as I turn the tap, and you just check to see there's no bubbles coming up through the bottom, and you take it up to about 10 psi. Around about 10 psi it should start to blow off. There you go. So that's a pass. He's okay for going on the casks. Well, we're all ready to start racking now. And the very first thing I should mention that nowadays I put some auxiliary finings in the day before I rack, which is the clear bottle up there, which is made from seaweed, I think, and that goes in the fermenter the night before the racking. So having done that, I'm now about to open the tap, and the first thing is to fill up about 2 gallons into that chap, which I'll then hoist back up on top of the fermenter and put it back into the fermenter, so that all the yeasty bit at the bottom is kind of distributed, so you don't get all the muck in the first cask off. It sort of evens it out a bit. That's a new thing that I do now. I don't know if you can see that. That's I've got the first couple of gallons there, and I'm running it back down a tube into the fermenter, so that you don't get any air in it. So that's just redistributing all the yeasty bit from the bottom. It's different yeast I'm using this time. It's from Princetown Brewery, and it's mainly a bottom working yeast, so it doesn't throw such an enormous head on the top. But that's the end of that. This is the first one being filled. Now I've sort of streamlined this fining operation, which is a bit of a sort of Harry Tate affair in the 20-year-old episode that you might have seen. So what I do now is I fill that one almost up, and then fill up a jar which we will use to mix up all the finings in after we've checked the gravity of it. So you can also see what it looks like, of course. Gives you an idea of what it might be like. So, do you think that's going to be drinkable tomorrow? Wait and see. If you were doing this for the first time, you'd be a bit worried about that, I think. But no need to be. And what we're doing now is just checking the final gravity, which is 10.4, I should think. 10.4. This brew started out at gravity of, what was it, 47 I think, and finished up at 10.4, and if you subtract those and divide by 7.36, you get a rough approximation of the alcohol by volume. It's not accurate, but this one works out at 4.7%. Not a bad drop. Now we're just about to mix up the finings. Those are the finings. And I'm just going to mix it up with the beer which we drew from the thingy. Okay? Don't go. So this process now goes ahead like a well-oiled machine, hopefully. 320 cc's of finings per 5-gallon barrel goes in. Bingo. Finish clean that one up. Ready for the next shaft. Empty any water out. You have to keep your mind on what you're doing here. No, these are heavier than they used to be. Can't think why. I'm just going to try a little experiment here, so I can show you the effect of this finings. I'm just putting 5 cc's of finings in there. As you can see, it's as thick as anything at the moment. And then we'll just stir that up, like so. Put it there and wait and see what happens. Time is now 11:15. And as you can see, it's pretty murky. And that's just 1/4 hour later. And you can see all the little bits clumping together. It's an electrostatic job. It's a question of the charges on the thingamies. So they sort of clump together and they're heavy enough to drop out of suspension. That's looking down into the empty fermenting vessel, so you can see the conical bit at the bottom. And this is the gadget that has got the sensor. The sensor in. It's just a bit of pipe with a stainless steel bolt shoved in the end. That works very well, actually. And there we have the result of all the toil. I think that says it all, doesn't it? This is not only the brewery tap, but the beer store. You can see I only brewed just in time. I'm about to run out. There's emergency supplies on the shelf. Yep, that's 40 minutes into it. Clumping in great big clumps. Well, just under 2 hours. And what a change. This little gadget in the foreground, by the way, is the cask rinser. I saw in that old film I used to stick the hose pipe up the end, but you just stick the barrel on top of that, making sure you do before you turn the tap on. Otherwise you get very wet. Demonstration. Simple but effective. That's after 6 hours, so I think the point is proven that it clears it very well indeed. The time has come, the walrus said, to clean out our beer store. So we've got a bit of bleach in here and really attacking it. Nothing that little bugs like better than beer, so it's all gets a bit grotty after a while. Oh yes. You remember me saying that these things are getting a bit heavier as the years go by? Well, we've had to be a bit sort of thinking about this job. So what we've done is we've got a block and tackle here. Whereas one day I used to just pick those up and throw them in. Brain not brawn. There you go. That's handy, Bill, isn't it? And this is the one. This is called Home Consumption 1, this cask. And you don't think I'm going to be drinking that tomorrow, having seen what it looked like just now. But I will be. I won't be enjoying it, because I know it's going to get better. I can still just about manage a 3-gallon one. Well, that's the last chap. It has to go in a bit like so. Now this is a funny thing. Makes everybody laugh, this. A heater. For the cellar. Because at the moment, it being January, we're up to, what are we now, a balmy 5 degrees. And this should be at 13 point something. So a little heater goes in there. Used to be an airing cupboard heater in our son's nursery. There you go. Well, we're not going to run out of beer for a day or two, are we? That's okay then. I've got another one of these magic thermostats that look after the temperature of this beer store, and as you can see, I just shoved all that lot in at 5 degrees or so, and the heat is on and it's just beginning to warm it up. Not a lot, up to sort of a cool cellar temperature. And the funny thing is, in the winter you feel lovely warm air coming out of there, and in the summer it feels gloriously cool. 24 hours have gone by and you'll see that the secondary fermentation is working okay in that cask. The pressure gauge I got tapped in there rather cleverly lets me know how much pressure is in the barrel. So now we come to the moment of a truth to see what it tastes like. Well, there's not much wrong with that, is there? 9 days after brewing. Cheers. A little young. Will improve. Give it about a week. Not bad then. That's the well that we dug when we first moved here, because we didn't have any water either. And it gives me great pleasure to know that from that well I've made 56,770 pints of beer, to put it another way, 31.7 tonnes, which, if I'd had to pay pub prices for it, would have cost me about 6 times what we paid for the house. And on that happy note, I will wish you farewell. A barrel of malt, a bushel of hops, you stir them around with a stick. They're kind of lubrication to make your engine tick. 20 pints of wallop a day will keep away the quacks. And it's only 8 halfpenny and 1 6 in tax. He must have been an admiral, a sultan or a king, and to his praises we shall always sing. Look what he has done for us, he's filled us up with cheer. Lord bless Charlie Mops, the man who invented beer.